I'd like to get start with you, Zach, and just kind of get you to reflect a little bit. You've watched this film now dozens of times.
Yeah.
I'd like to hear some of your, well, did anything strike you differently this evening? Or what strikes you as the most, sort of important piece of the film as the person who really did live with Dr. Leary the longest?
Every time I see it, like you said, I've seen it many, many times now, and we also have to remember Ram Dass is alive and well.
Yes.
Yeah. So, and I'm still pretty close with Ram Dass.
In fact, he gave an interview for APA last year, for the American Psychiatric Association last year. So that was really, really interesting. But
yeah, and I see him in Hawaii maybe once or twice a year, sometimes more. So what always kind of inspires me about the film is really just thinking about the cultural impact that they both had, the lasting cultural impact that they both had, and where in the different facets of our not just psychiatric culture and getting into the nitty-gritty research, but also within pop culture. All the little tentacles that they each kind of had their fingers in. It's it's arguable that we wouldn't. Somebody told me once, and I haven't fact-checked it, but it's more or less true that in 1963 there were only 3 places to practice yoga in America, like actual asana, go take a yoga class in 1963.
Wow. And
it's arguable that without, Ram Dass and a few others as well, that, that explosion wouldn't have happened. And of course, when we start talking about my dad and Timothy and everything that he did and his reflection and his influence into rock and roll and of course the science of psychedelic research and psychology, but that's what I really get when I watch the film. It's just, gosh, they really, they set out to do a lot and accomplished it.
Great, thanks. And Rick, what are your thoughts, initial reactions? You've seen the film, I'm sure.
Yeah, I've seen the movie. Gay showed it to me before even she got Robert Redford to narrate it. And I went over it kind of frame by frame for all of the background images and things. And I'm amazed at how much progress that she's made. I mean, she worked on this for over 20 years.
Right.
It's an incredible feat that she's done. And even though I'm so focused on trying to bring psychedelics back through the FDA, through scientific research for medical conditions, the movie just really makes it clear that that's just a narrow subset of the potential value of psychedelics if they're integrated into our culture.
Yeah.
And I think the political aspects of it, coming from the deep psychological aspects of the experience, are something that our culture has struggled with a lot. And that's, for me, my career kind of veered off in 1988. I'd been actually, since 1971, when I was 18, had decided to become a psychedelic therapist. And I was a draft resistor and identified as a counterculture drug-using criminal. And and what could you do in those circumstances but become a psychedelic therapist? I was anticipating going to jail, but I wanted to try to study psychedelic psychotherapy, and in '87 it was clear that no graduate school was going to let me in, and that's where I shifted and went to the Kennedy School and studied the politics of Schedule I research. And so the way in which both more Tim than Ram Dass really saw the political struggle as something that they definitely needed to engage in. And I really admire this idea that science is not science in a vacuum, and that you really have to take it outside of, or you have to look at the implications of the science that you're doing. And I think that each of them went in different directions, but it was because of the science that they did that Tim went into sort of social change, and Ram Dass went into sort of inner space, as he says. And I think they complement each other really well.
Yeah.
And I think we've now reached a point where 50 years later, our culture feels ready.
I mean, that's right.
You mentioned, just about the few places where you could study yoga.
Yeah.
The first hospice center, and hospice was featured in the movie, was 1974. And by 2004, there was over 3,500 of them.
Right.
So I think we kind of can easily get impatient that social change takes,
Well,
decades and decades, but it's really not that long.
To wit, I mean, we've got, as I mentioned, Paul Summergrad interviewed Ram Dass at an APA meeting and talked about his experiences with LSD, the president of the American Psychiatric Association. That to me is a sea change. Yeah. Well, it brings up the question, you talk about complementary and different roles of these compounds in one's life. And in bioethics, we talk a lot about death and dying well. We can get to that actually in this conversation. But I want to actually ask you guys what you think about the ways in which these compounds, we'll call them, can potentially enhance one's ability to be more ethical, be better citizens, be better people to ourselves and to others. And what are the ethical implications of enhancing, in a sense, enhancing one's own ethical prowess, morality, values? And then we'll get to another question about the therapeutic uses. Yeah. So, but this is more of a question about moral enhancement and whether you think that's good, right, wrong. What are the sort of implications there?
Yeah, well, I think this idea of psychedelics changing your morality is what made them so controversial during the 60s, and that's what really led to the backlash, because a lot of people were inspired by their psychedelic experiences to get more involved with the political struggles of the day. And I think the key aspect of LSD and what we learned from this neuroscience study, and same for psilocybin, mescaline, the classic psychedelics, is that the default mode network, sort of our resting state ego identification, is weakened by these drugs. And these are the filtering systems of our brain. And they filter according to what we really think we need to do for survival or for our various needs. And they keep us focused. And they keep us locked sort of into our individuality. And these sections of the brain, our activity is reduced in them. And then there's a lot more connectivity going on under the influence of psychedelics. And so we tend to have this ego dissolution, but this identification with all that is. And I think that's the fundamental moral principle, is that we feel that we're connected to people and to nature, even people that are different from us or a different religion. And I think that empathy and connection with others has political implications.
Right, yeah.
MDMA is a little bit different in that it does offer spiritual experiences as well, but it doesn't do it so much through dissolving the ego, but Stan Grof uses an expression, it helps you become transparent to the transcendent. And that empathy, and it stimulates oxytocin and prolactin. So that kind of empathy also has moral implications.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
And that's where I think we really need to, for survival with all the crises that we're facing, facilitate these kind of deeper identifications and deeper empathy. And I think the need is so great that that's another reason. This is why we're ready to integrate these drugs now. Society has matured over these 50 years, but also the need is more apparent and greater.
Yeah.